This video is supported by the project called Gregor Mendel's Legacy to Science, Culture and Humanity, co-financed by the Interreg Austria-Czech Republic. More about the project at the end of the video. Hello everyone, welcome back to the Genomics Bootcamp. This is a special presentation with a guest speaker, Professor Gregory Radick. Professor Radick is a professor of history and philosophy of science at the University of Leeds. This presentation you are about to see is called Napp, Mendel and the Problem of Heredity, which was originally given at the Mendel Days in Brno in 2021. Well, I had the pleasure to be there at this conference, and I liked the presentation very much. Honestly, I never thought a history of science could be so interesting. So also that is why I took the opportunity and asked Professor Radick for the pre-recorded presentation that was available for that conference. In this presentation, you will learn much more about the actual environment Mendel was working in and also the conditions he had in the Augustinian Abbey in Brno while making his famous discoveries. You will learn that the Abbey was actually a very good place for science, and there were also other interesting people who created an enabling environment for Mendel's discoveries. Most importantly, perhaps Mendel's predecessor as an about Napp, but more about this in the presentation. One more thing about the presenter, Professor Radick. So he has a really neat website, gregoryradick.com, where he has, well, his bio and information about all his numerous and wide-ranging publications. And also there are recordings of his lectures, teachings and presentations. So I include the link into the description of this video, and I encourage you to visit also that website to learn much more about the history of science. As I found out recently, it is a really interesting topic. But for now, we go forward with the presentation of Professor Radick on Napp, Mendel, and the problem of heredity.
Okay, dobrý den všichni. Hello, everyone. I'm Greg Radick from the University of Leeds. I'm so sorry that I can't be with you in person today. That's not the only apology I need to make, because when I was last in Brno in 2017, not only was I there in person, but I gave my talk in Czech. You can see me there on a splendid occasion at Mendel University when they unveiled a new statue of Mendel and dedicated a refurbished hall. For me, it was an absolutely terrifying, but after I got through my speech, a wonderfully enjoyable event. And I very much hope that I can join you again in Brno in the future. Today, I'm going to be talking about Gregor Mendel and Cyril Napp. We see Mendel, of course, there with the letter M above him in the photograph, and Napp is there seated with the large cross holding the Bible to Mendel's right. Here's what I'm going to be talking about today. First, I'll give you a very brief overview of the life and career of Abbot Cyril Napp. What I really want to focus in on is a tradition in the history of Mendel's studies. And that's why I've called this talk Napp, Mendel, and the Problem of Heredity. It's a tradition which says that Mendel's famous 1866 paper solved the puzzle of heredity as framed by Napp at a meeting of sheep breeders in Brunn, as it was known at the time, in 1837. And I'm going to be giving you an example of a recent writer who is a participant in this tradition of interpretation, right? So Napp set the agenda, solved the puzzle of heredity, and Mendel solved it. I'm then going to turn in the latter part of the talk and give you some reasons for questioning that tradition, some reasons for thinking that maybe that's not the best way of thinking about what Napp did for Mendel. And I'm going to conclude with some final reflections on what Napp didn't do for Mendel, but also what he did. So that's where we're going. Let's begin with this brief overview of the life and career of Abbot Cyril Napp. There he is near the end of his life. What can we say about him? Well, he was born in 1792 in Gewich, or as it's now known, Jewiczko, right, in Western Moravia. His father was a master glove maker who converted to Catholicism from Protestant Christianity. He was educated in Olomouc at secondary school and then through to philosophical studies that he undertook at Palacký University, Olomouc, which was at that time a Jesuit institution. In 1810, he entered the monastery of St. Thomas in Brunn, and he took the name Cyril. Until then, he was František. At that point, he began studies at the Theological Seminary in Brunn, and in 1815, he was ordained. Less than 10 years later, he was elected abbot of the monastery, and extraordinarily, he presided as abbot for over 40 years. Quite an amazing tenure. He died in Brunn in 1867, at which point, as we all know, Gregor Mendel, who had entered the monastery in 1843, took over as abbot. And Mendel served as abbot from that point until his own death in 1884. Now, many of us inherit a picture of the monastic life as a life which is deliberately sequestered, a life which is isolated from the world. Right here we see the monk in his cell, withdrawn from the hubbub, from the business of life. That wasn't at all the Augustinian tradition as Napp knew it and as Napp represented it. Napp was a worldly man, fully engaged in the life of his city, and he turned the monastery at St. Thomas in those 40 years over which he was abbot into a kind of a scientific seminar in a way that, as I'll stress later in the talk, benefited Mendel hugely. So we mustn't think at all when we think of a monk in the lines of that picture we saw. On the contrary, with Cyril Napp, we're talking about someone very lively, very engaged in his world, and someone who made the monastery an extraordinarily lively place, especially intellectually. So there we have, again, Napp, and we have Mendel. And I want to talk a little bit about Napp as a civically minded man of learning. How did this manifest itself? Well, at the Theological Seminary in Brno, he becomes professor of Old Testament and Oriental languages. Most important for our purposes was that he was hugely interested in agricultural improvement, especially in the scientifically guided breeding and cultivation of domesticated fruit trees, vines, and sheep, these being economically important activities in Moravia. Just to outline a few of Napp's achievements, and I don't have the time to go into them in detail, but in the mid-1820s, and bear in mind here, we're talking about someone who is the professor of Old Testament, right? Someone who is biblically learned. He nevertheless writes a manual on how to grow improved varieties. He's a serious participant in practical improvement in the city and its region. He establishes a new nursery at St. Thomas, which itself becomes important for research in vine breeding. And he's extraordinarily active in the many scientific societies in the city and beyond, the Pomological Association, concerned with fruit trees, the Agricultural Society, and the Sheep Breeders Association, which is connected with the Agricultural Society. So that's a bit about Napp, his life and his career. I now want to turn to that interpretation of Napp and Mendel that I mentioned at the start. The interpretation which says that Napp set the agenda and Mendel fulfilled it, right? Napp set the puzzle of how heredity works, and Mendel solved the puzzle. With Napp framing the problem at a meeting of sheep breeders in 1837. And I just can't resist a small digression here. It's sometimes said that Brunn at that time was the Manchester of Central Europe. But I think that's a little bit misleading because, of course, Manchester was built not on wool, but on cotton. Manchester was known at the time as Cottonopolis, right? The cotton city. I think if we want an analog for Brunn, I think we should talk about Leeds, which is my city here in the UK. Brunn was the Leeds of Central Europe because Leeds, like Brunn, was dependent on wool. It was a textile city where wool was the major fabric. And there's a picture of Leeds from a famous painting by J.M.W. Turner, the great British painter, which shows you something of its growing industrial might in the period that we're talking about. And again, I can't resist yet another digression. You might be interested to know that the first DNA image, the first photograph of DNA was taken not in California, not in Cambridge, but in Leeds with the camera that you see there. That's an X-ray camera from the 1930s, from the laboratory of a man called William Astbury. At Leeds, his title was textile physicist. He was brought to the university in order to work out the molecular structure of fibers, principally wool, right? The fiber that mattered most industrially for Leeds industry. And out of those investigations come some of the foundational studies of molecular biology. So I think the Leeds-Brunn connection is one to be pursued. But to go back to 1837, the Sheep Breeders Association holds its annual conference at Brunn. And here I want to turn to a recent, rather wonderful book about Mendel by Simon Maurer called Gregor Mendel, Planting the Seeds of Genetics. And here is Maurer's really well-written version of that tradition of interpretation that I've mentioned. Here's how Maurer puts it. Napp's interest in sheep breeding was both scientific and commercial, right? More than 50% of the convent's income was through the wool trade. But above all, it was enthusiastic. They argued around and around, these worthy men. They were farmers, breeders, mill owners, and textile magnates. There was much confused talk, but occasional clarity shone through. It was Abbot Napp himself who declared, and his very words are reported in the minutes of one meeting in 1837. Here's the important bit. The question for discussion should not be the theory and process of breeding, but what is inherited and how. Right? So Napp poses the question, what is inherited and how? At that sheep breeders meeting in 1837. Maurer continues, 6 years after he had set the agenda, it was Cyril Napp himself who welcomed Gregor Mendel into the monastery. It would be Mendel who would take up the abbot's challenge. So that's the tradition of interpretation that I want us now to put under the microscope. The tradition which says that Napp in 1837 framed the puzzle, framed the agenda, what is inherited and how, and Gregor Mendel was brought into the monastery and then educated and given all of those resources, right? Given all of that space at the monastery to do his experiments, all that time off from other duties in order to solve the puzzle that Napp had set. I want us now to begin to question that tradition. It's immensely attractive, but alas, it's problematic, or so I want to persuade you. Let's begin by looking at the title of Mendel's paper. Versuche über Pflanzenhybriden. It doesn't say experiments on plant heredity. In fact, the German word for inheritance, for heredity, barely comes up anywhere in the paper. It comes up once in passing. It's not an important moment in the paper at all. Certainly not, as we can see, something that Mendel thought important enough to put in the title of his paper. Instead, he puts hybrids. What's going on here? What's this paper actually about? As you read the paper, or rather, as you read the paper when you're really trying not to import present-day understandings of Mendelian genetics, when we really try to read Mendel's paper in the context of his own times, what we find is that Mendel is operating with a really interesting distinction, which is kind of unfamiliar to us now. And it's a distinction between two kinds of hybrids. There are what he calls constant hybrids and what he calls variable hybrids. Let's talk about the constant hybrids first. What does that mean? Well, for Mendel, a constant hybrid is something that arises when you cross one plant, right, plant A, with another plant, plant B. You cross those plants, and the offspring plant has this interesting new character. Maybe a character that you find very attractive as a breeder, right? Something you want to be able to commercialize. What happens when that plant then goes on itself to have offspring, perhaps self-fertilizes? Well, with a constant hybrid, the new hybrid character persists. It stays constant, generation after generation, right? So with a constant hybrid, you bring together A and B, you get C, and then C stays into the future. That's one class of hybrid plants, according to Mendel, right? That's the constant hybrid. A and B come together, make C, and C sticks. C persists. Then, Mendel says, there's this other class of hybrid, the variable hybrids, the non-constant hybrids. What are they like? Well, in this case, you bring together plant with character A and plant with character B. The offspring here has character C, but then on self-fertilization, further crossing, the old parental characters come back. That's what Mendel means by a variable hybrid. The new hybrid character doesn't persist. It doesn't stick. It breaks up. And that's what Mendel's paper is about. Mendel says, my paper is not going to be about the constant hybrids. And those of you who will know Mendel's hawkweed paper, the paper on hawkweeds, that paper was an attempt to address constant hybrids. That's what he did next. But this paper, the paper about peas and a little bit about beans, is concerned with variable hybrids. That's why the peas are interesting, right? When you take, Mendel says, a yellow-seeded pea and a green-seeded pea variety, and you cross them, all of the offspring are yellow, but when those peas are permitted to self-fertilize, the green-seeded character comes back, rather curiously in the ratio of 3:1. That's a variable hybrid, right? The yellow character didn't just persist. Instead, one of the parental characters, which had disappeared in the hybrid generation, comes back again. And of course, as we know, Mendel not only documents this, but he explains it brilliantly, right? He says, let's suppose that in the yellow-seeded pea plants, there is yellow-making stuff. Call it big A. And in the green-seeded pea plants, there is green-making stuff. Call that little a. When the yellow-seeded pea plants are crossed with the green-seeded pea plants, yellow-making stuff and green-making stuff come together in a single organism. But because yellow is dominant to green, all of the plants have yellow seeds. And that's all that dominance means for Mendel. Dominance means when the two kinds of stuff are in union in a hybrid offspring, only the one character is visible. But now suppose, Mendel says, that when those hybrids form gametes, form pollen cells, form egg cells, those gametes don't get the union, yellow making stuff, green making stuff, but either yellow making stuff or green making stuff. And suppose furthermore that it's just a matter of chance, which gamete meets with which gamete. And this is a famous analysis, we all know it. Mendel shows that if by chance any gamete can meet with any gamete, we get his 3-to-1 ratio. Big A meets with big A, we get a yellow-seeded pea plant. Big A meets with little a, we get a yellow-seeded pea plant because yellow is dominant. Little a meets with big A, again, a yellow-seeded pea plant. Only when little a meets with little a, when green making stuff meets with green making stuff, the recessive character meets with the recessive character, do we get the recessive character in the offspring, the green? A beautiful explanation. So the paper is a paper which addresses itself to the question of variable hybrids, whether there is a pattern to the distribution of characters in the offspring, and if there is a pattern, can Mendel explain it? And brilliantly, he does all of that. So that's what this paper, as I see it, and here I'm not being original, I'm following really the mainstream of historians of science. That's what this paper is about. It's about just what it says it's about in the title, not heredity, but hybrids. And if we ask, why is that Mendel's question? Why is the question of variable hybrids on his mind? I think we can look to a number of factors. Most immediately, and here he is very much part of Cyril Napp's world, Mendel was very interested in practical questions of breeding, not least flower breeding. And if I turn to this beautiful edition of Mendel's paper, published by the Mendel Museum, and we turn to the very first page, what's Mendel's first sentence? Mendel says, artificial fertilizations that were carried out on ornamental plants with the aim of producing new color variants provided the motivation for the experiments that shall be reviewed here. Right? And the picture reminds us that Mendel was known in his own day for his own work as a practical breeder of fuchsia, the flower. So ornamental flowers and the prospect of getting attractive new colors by crossing existing flowers was something that was commercially valuable, something that Mendel took a lively interest in. So there was a practical question in view, but there were also intellectual issues that were lively for Mendel because he had been a student at the University of Vienna of the man you see here, Franz Unger, a man who had sought, as he called it, a physics of the plant organism. And one can see Unger as someone at the intersection of a number of really lively Central European traditions in the study of life at that moment. One of them, a tradition associated with Alexander von Humboldt, a search for the quantitative laws of life. Another with the Goethean tradition of comparative morphology, where one is searching for the underlying form, the form which underlies, the simple form underlying all of the diversity. And then the cell theory, right? The theory which says that all life comes from cells and cells themselves come from cells. Unger, at the intersection of these three traditions, was searching for the mathematical laws of life as climate gave on to climate over the history of the earth. I think a good reading of Mendel is one which sees him as bringing this intellectual heritage from Unger's classroom to the practical questions that mattered for him and others in his world about, for example, ornamental flowers and how to get new colors that will persist over time. And I want to just try a little bit more to dramatize the contrast between an interest just in hybrids and an interest in larger questions about inheritance or heredity. And I'm going to do that by turning briefly from Mendel to someone that Mendel read, Charles Darwin, and talk a little bit about the way that inheritance is treated in Darwin's famous book, The Variations of Animals and Plants Under Domestication, published in 1867. What do we find in that book? We find that Darwin himself undertook crossing experiments in which resembled what Mendel did very closely. He did them with snapdragons. So we here see two different forms, snapdragon. Crossing, one form is the one that predominates. And then in the next generation, the old form comes back in the ratio of 3:1. Darwin reports that. He doesn't think it's a big deal because for him, inheritance is much larger than that. This is just something that happens some of the time. Incidentally, I should have said Darwin's book was published in 1868, not 1867. Pushing on. If we ask, how does Darwin handle the question of what is inherited and how, beyond the matter of hybrid forms and the way that old forms come back over time? We find, for example, that for Darwin, one of the sub-questions that one addresses is to do with what we call Lamarckian inheritance. The idea that the blacksmith passes on a stronger arm to his offspring because the blacksmith has spent a lifetime at the forge, hammering away. So what is inherited? A more improved character. How is it inherited? By some form of inheritance which permits activity in the course of the lifetime of the parent, not just to change an organ or a limb, but for that change itself to be passed on. Mendel has no interest whatsoever in that kind of a phenomenon. It's not addressed at all, but it was part of what one was expected to address if you're thinking about inheritance in the middle of the 19th century. Here's another example. Darwin was fascinated by what he called Yarrell's law. And what Yarrell's law said was that when two breeds of dog, for example, were crossed, the breed which was older, the breed which was more established, would have its characters represented much more extensively than would the breed which was younger and less established. So you wouldn't just expect equality, you would expect an unequal representation, based, however, on the history of the breeds and on which one was older and which one was younger. Again, a kind of a question which was lively for 19th century students of heredity, but which was just not on the minds of Mendel in the research he did in his paper and in the writing of it. So I hope I've said enough to convince you that when we're confronting Mendel's beautiful paper on the experiments that he did at the monastery in the 1850s and the 1860s, we're not confronting a paper which aims to solve the puzzle of heredity. It aims to solve a much smaller puzzle, and it solves it beautifully in Mendel's terms, the puzzle of variable hybrids. That was not the agenda that Napp set in 1837. So let me turn in conclusion to what Napp did and didn't do for Mendel. I've given you a brief overview of his life and career. We've concentrated on the tradition which says Napp set the agenda, right? Solve the puzzle of heredity, and Mendel fulfilled the goal. Mendel solved that puzzle. I then gave you some reasons for thinking that's not how to think about the relationship between Napp and Mendel. So how should we think about the relationship between them? What did Napp do for Mendel? I want to return, if you don't mind, to what I said a few years ago at the talk that I gave at the unveiling of the Mendel statue. It was a little talk on Mendel's significance. And what I tried to do there was to suggest that Mendel's paper, as an example of great science, reminds us that all great science comes from creative dialogues of three kinds: a dialogue with the past, a dialogue with the present, and a dialogue with the future. And in writing about Mendel's dialogue with the present, in writing about his own time and how he fitted, here's what I said. And here again, I'm quoting from the beautiful edition, which I recommend to all of you, from the museum, of Mendel's paper. My remarks are published at the back. And what I said there is that I wanted to mention the existence of a community of people who are prepared to join in creative, critical dialogue with each other. Brunn in Mendel's day was a kind of permanent scientific seminar, with St. Thomas's Monastery as one of its hubs, and the wider science of Europe flowing through via journals, books, and visitors. When Mendel returned from his studies in Vienna, he found himself surrounded by scientifically inclined people keen to discuss the latest advances in natural science and its practical applications. It was a very encouraging environment. Although a persistent legend portrays Mendel's audience at his 1865 lectures as bored or confused, the evidence suggests otherwise. They were serious people, and they recognized and appreciated his achievement. His paper itself, moreover, shows that Mendel had kept up to date with the latest progress in biology beyond Brunn, notably in cell theory and Darwinian evolutionary theory. He never saw himself as isolated, and no one in isolation would ever have produced that amazing paper. So I think when we ask ourselves, what did Napp do for Mendel? It was Napp who created that extraordinarily fertile, extraordinarily stimulating intellectual environment where Mendel could be plugged in to the best of the sciences of his day and stick with it through an extraordinarily demanding research program. When you read Mendel's paper, you realize you're in the company not only of someone who's very brilliant, but someone who persisted through quite difficult sets of experiments. It takes the right kind of ambiance, the right kind of environment for that kind of activity to be undertaken and then appreciated. And to a large extent, I think Napp should be credited with having created that. So credit where credit is due, all credit to Abbot Napp. And thank you all for listening. And I look forward to your discussion on the day. Thank you very much. Děkuji moc krát.
This video was supported by the project number ATCZ278 with the title Gregor Johann Mendel's Legacy to Science, Culture and Humanity, which is co-financed by the Interreg Austria and Czech Republic. Down below you see the title of the project in German and Czech. The main goal of the project is actually to promote Mendel's legacy by long-term cross-border collaboration in science and culture. There is a strategic plan developed that will promote this legacy in the fields of science and culture in Czech Republic, Austria, but also worldwide. This promotion will take various forms, be it meetings, workshops, publications, audio and video materials. One of the main parts of the project is actually rebuilding Mendel's original greenhouse in the Augustinian Abbey in Brno. This newly rebuilt greenhouse will be a new landmark, not just the city of Brno or the country of Czech Republic, but the entirety of the scientific fields of genetics as such. Mendel's greenhouse is the very place where genetics was born, with the first genetic experiment conducted on peas. Therefore, it is a really, really important location for the field of genetics. As a major outcome of this Interreg project, this greenhouse will become available for the general public, but also the scientific community as a multi-purpose gathering place for cultural and scientific events. This and much more you can find out if you visit the website gjm200.cz, which of course stands for Gregor Johann Mendel, and the 200 indicating the 200th birthday of Gregor Mendel, which we celebrate in 2022. Once again, a great thank you to the project and Interreg for the support of this video. Thank you for your time you spent on it watching. And from my side, I just wish you a very nice day.